Welcome to Threshold Conversations. I'm Amy Martin, and my guest today is Dr. J. Drew Lanham.
I can't separate the air, the water, the soil, the earth from my inalienable rights to life, liberty, and some pursuit of happiness.
Drew Lanham is an alumni distinguished professor of wildlife ecology at Clemson University. He's also an author and a poet who writes about his experiences as a hunter, a wanderer, a birder, and a Black American. His award-winning book, called The Home Place: Memoirs of a Colored Man's Love Affair with Nature, was published in 2016. It traces Dr. Lanham's path to becoming a scientist and a naturalist, starting with his childhood when he bonded deeply with the land, water, plants, and creatures of Edgefield County, South Carolina. When he was 12, he happened upon a copy of a Sand County Almanac by Aldo Leopold, and he credits reading about Leopold's concept of a land ethic, in which values of love and respect are incorporated into how we think about nature, as changing the direction of his life. Dr. Lanham went on to serve on the board of the Aldo Leopold Foundation, among many other conservation organizations. In 2019, the National Audubon Society honored him with the Lufkin Prize, which recognizes individuals who've dedicated their entire lives to the environment. Drew Lanham, thank you for joining me today on Threshold Conversations.
Great to be here, Amy. Thank you for having me.
I'm a budding bird nerd, and so I have to ask, what's your favorite bird?
Right now, I have a special place in my heart for loggerhead shrikes. Um, the bird that many people know colloquially as the butcher bird. So it's a songbird, it's a passerine, but it's also very raptorial, and so it will capture insects like large grasshoppers and such, but also small mammals like shrews and mice, and occasionally smaller songbirds. And because it has weak feet, it will impale its victims on spikes and spines and barbed wire, which is a sort of a morose, grotesque thing. But because it's a bird that I say code switches, much like some of us have to code switch between cultures, workplace and home, um, friends and professional peers, I like shrikes. So right now, that's my favorite bird.
What does it look like?
Well, if you can imagine a northern mockingbird-esque kind of appearance. So it's a bird of gray tones overall, with black and white in the wing, so that when it flies, it almost looks like a checkered flag. And so it has this sort of diagnostic shallow wing beat, rapid wing beat, and it has a hooked beak that looks very raptorial. And along with that hooked beak, it has a black mask. So a very distinctive bird, perches upright on its sentry posts, and it's a bird that's declining. So that makes it special as well. It's a bird that has been persecuted um, for a long time, in part because people see it as they see it as a bird that's harmful to other songbirds, and they don't like its character as a predatory songbird. So again, for me, in the way that I try to see birds, Amy, it's a bird that suffers undue persecution, and those birds are very special to me. So because it helps me as a black man relate to these birds in this very different sort of way. I think that gives we share we share, unfortunately, some of those same roles. So loggerhead shrikes are one of those birds that suffers because of perception.
Hmm. I'm going to look it up.
They used to be really common all over across most of the United States, and again they've suffered in part in the early portion of the 20th century. They were openly persecuted, and along with many raptors, hawks and falcons and the like. But now they're suffering from habitat loss, probably pesticide use, and that kind of thing. So I've been paying a lot of attention to shrikes when I see them.
Well, I'm I'm really eager to get into all of these weighty issues that are so at the fore right now. And I want to ground our conversation in your story, starting with your childhood in South Carolina, which you write about so beautifully in your book, The Home Place. One of the really fascinating figures to me in the book is your paternal grandmother. I wonder what the first thing is that comes to your mind if I say, tell me about Mamatha.
Wow. Tell me about my math. My whole life, really. I think every day I think about her and her influence. I grew up with her on the home place, really. My mother and father agreed to let her keep me. She only lived about maybe a little more than a quarter of a mile away from my parents' house. And in a really kind of almost falling down house I call the ramshackle. In the book, I call my parents' house the ranch. But Mamatha, which is this, that name came from Mommy Ethel. Her name was Ethel Bell Jennings Lanham, and I could not say Mommy Ethel as a child, and so it became Mamatha. And so from you know less than a year old until I was 15, I spent roughly half of my life with her. I stayed over there. I slept over there, and then I would. I've been a lifelong migrant. It seems I would migrate to my parents' house, and they would drive us all to school, and then I'd come home, do chores, eat dinner at my parents' house, and then migrate back to my grandmother's house, to my Martha's house, to sleep and do chores, and so she had as much influence on me as anyone in my parents' house, really, because she sort of laid the groundwork for who I am in many many ways, and I'm only coming to appreciate that, sort of in this late midlife discovery of self. So I find myself quoting her more and more. Um, I find myself sort of hearkening back sometimes to recipes that she used. I'll use names for birds that she used. So she used to call eastern kingbirds bee martins. She called yellow-billed cuckoos rain crows. So, and I find myself falling back into that. So thank you for asking. She had everything to do with who I am now.
And you do such a beautiful job in the book of evoking her complex personhood and the rich physical landscape that you grew up in. And when you think about your grandmother and your parents, you know, it feels in the book like they were very much shaped by that place, and then you as well. What are some of the things that you think are distinctive about Edgefield County, South Carolina, that show up in them and in you?
Well, Edgefield is a unique place. I mean, ecologically, it sits in the Piedmont, which is really sort of the foot of the mountains, in a way, but really sort of broken country now. It's at the fall line, which means that it sits at that place where the rivers began to tumble um, precipitously seaward. So it was a place at one point in time that was kind of a frontier, because some of those falls and shoals kept people really from going northward. But it was a place that became farmland. It wasn't a place of huge plantations, but certainly enslavement was an important part, sadly, of what went on in the Piedmont with cotton farming, especially, but more small tract farming than you would find towards the coast, where people were cultivating thousands of acres and rice and cotton. But that Piedmont place is unique, and that's where my grandfather of many greats, Harry, was brought, probably about 1790 from the Mid Atlantic, to to help the Lanham boys, the white Lanham boys, grow cotton after they had farmed out the Mid Atlantic from tobacco. They had burned up the soil, And then where I grew up on the home place, roughly a 200-acre farm, is was just this wonderful patchwork quilt of farm, fields, forests, the creeks, the bottomland that would flood from time to time, wild turkey, white-tailed deer, songbirds, bobwhite quail, and and so that place, that historically my ancestors were bound to by chattel slavery, became a place that we were bound to, by sustenance, because most of the meat that we ate, most of the vegetables that we ate, all of the water that we drank came from a spring there. We raised our own cows and hogs and, um, vegetable gardens, and my father hayed the fields and grew corn, for the cows and for feed. So it was this sort of self-sustaining operation in many ways. Both my parents were teachers, but they were also farmers. So it was this sort of biphasic life of living very close to the land daily, um, drinking water that had no taste of chlorine, eating vegetables that had no taint of a can, um, understanding that your food came from the ground and walked around, in front of you, and then going to school in Aiken County where my parents taught, envying my friends because they had sidewalks to skate on and skateboard on and paved roads on which to ride their bicycles. And I learned to ride my bike, and my siblings and I learned to ride our bikes on dirt roads. We had dirt clod wars. Um, there were no street lights, and so it was in many ways an idyllic upbringing. It was very isolated socially in many ways. So we had to depend on one another, for company. I depended mostly on wild things, on wild animals, and wandering in the woods and fields, and creating sort of my own fun, in many ways, Amy, between my grandmother's ramshackle and my parents' house. So all of that made it a very special place. It made it, and when you depend on the land, you come to love the land in a very different way.
Hmm. One of the most evocative chapters in the memoir to me was the one called Whose Eye is on the Sparrow? And
Mm.
it tells the story of you receiving your first BB gun. And I wonder if you could just walk us briefly through that story and kind of what you got out of that experience. Do you remember how old you were when you got that gun?
Yeah, I believe I was 10, when I got my first BB gun, a Daisy Cub. It was the Daisy Cub was the cheaper version of the Red Ryder, and I had been asking for one for a couple of Christmases. And when I finally got that BB gun, I remember that cold morning. I specifically put on these clothes that would make me feel at least like some sort of frontiersman. I had this brown corduroy coat with a white, um, pile cotton pile collar, and I put that on, and I tucked my jeans inside my boots, because that's what a trapper or some other explorer would do. And I went out, and, I spent a lot of time just walking around that Christmas morning before breakfast. And then after breakfast, I couldn't wait to get back out again. And I remember there was this distinctive sort of, as the air compressed the chamber and the spring flew forward, and you could actually see the BB leave the barrel, and you could see it arc, right? And so, that was useful because it taught me holdover. Um, it taught me that I had to aim slightly above what I was shooting. And so in short order, I became pretty proficient. I was killing tin can after tin can. I was knocking off pine cones. And after a while, I went afield and I thought, okay, now I'm going to hunt. I'm going to hunt something. And I remember walking into my parents' front yard, and there was this. It's a huge tree now, but there was this small pecan tree, and there was a bird that had perched about halfway up this, I don't know, 20-foot tall tree. It wasn't very tall at all. But I can remember seeing this bird just so neatly sitting there, inviting me. It seemed, to shoot at it, and so I cocked my rifle, laid my cheek on that stock, and fired, and sort of horrifically watched in slow motion, watched this BB um, hit this bird, and I could hear it, just the just thwack, and the bird fell to the ground, and fluttered, and then didn't move, and so I had no idea what that was going to be like, you know, to have. I mean, I was killing tin cans and pine cones, and so this little bird that I hit, and it was a chipping sparrow, um, that I had killed. I immediately felt remorseful because I had no plans. I wasn't going to eat the bird, um, and so I buried this little bird. I remember, um, it felt like I was trying to hide some sin,
Hmm.
and so I buried it on the edge of the yard in this little shallow scrape, and covered it over with um, dirt and leaves, and then went inside, and I didn't take my BB gun out again for days. Um, and I'm a hunter now. I hunt primarily white-tailed deer, and I don't hunt things that I'm not going to eat. That's the deal, right? But then I had no sense of that ethic. So that morning was a huge lesson for me, Amy, in that life is a precious thing that you don't take um, cavalierly.
Yeah. Well, reading that story, like I said, it was really an emotional story for me. I could feel your excitement and the sudden shock and pain, and I think that was really brave of you to like bring people into that whole experience, and knowing that you had said earlier in the book that you were really influenced by Aldo Leopold. I wondered when you came upon his work later, and especially the story of the fierce green fire dying in the eyes of the wolf that he killed, and when he was a much older man and had a sort of a similar experience. Did you make the connection when you read that of like, oh, that's kind of like what happened to me with the sparrow, or does it feel connected to you? Because it sure did to me.
Well, thanks for making the connection. Amy, you're the first person to do that. And when you said it, yeah, it connects. But I had never thought about that maybe as my moment, and thinking like a mountain, in that moment, and sort of, and thinking like a sparrow. But it was an important moment for me, and I remember writing that, and it took a turn for me in remembering, and it still does. I for a long time I was a turkey hunter, and not a very good one, because in part, during the spring turkey season, there are lots of other birds in the woods that I'm constantly watching and looking at, and so wild turkeys have an amazing eyesight, so they would always make me. I was good at calling turkeys in, but I wasn't good at closing the deal. And the one or two turkeys that I ever killed in, you know, almost 30 years of turkey hunting, it was always not as satisfying eating that bird, because a wild turkey is very wiry, and the legs are almost inedible. And I felt like I had wasted really so much of this animal, just for a small portion of meat. So um, I don't have anything against people who hunt birds. but it's more difficult for me if I'm not going to eat something. So, Leopold's story that evolved over decades for him to realize that thinking like a mountain, and killing that wolf did not mean more deer, that it meant that the mountain might suffer. That for me, the ethic of understanding that there's this sort of implicit deal that I've kind of made with animals, in that the only way that I'm going to take your life is that ultimately I'm going to give mine back to you. So, my wish is that when I'm done, that I'm burned, and that my ashes end up somewhere, to maybe at the base of some oak tree or at its drip line, so that ultimately I become the acorns that ultimately become the whitetail, some future whitetail buck whose who maybe whose ancestors um, I killed while I was hunting and consumed, but then ultimately that circle is complete. I can that deal I can I can live with, because I know I'm going to ultimately die and become the creatures that whose lives I took. But that story still still chokes me up a little bit, because again, it was as a kid. You're out there, and lots of kids have lots of kids used to have BB guns, and they'd go out and shoot robins and things like that. And um, but I can vividly remember burying that sparrow, and wondering if God saw me, um, but then putting that gun in the corner and not touching it for a very long time.
Well, I'm going to fast forward a bit into your story now, and I'm going to quote you back to yourself. I thought this was such a poignant line from your book. You wrote, "Most of my life has been ruled by convention, an attachment to certainty, and trying to meet everyone else's expectations." And one of those expectations, as I understood it, was that as an academically gifted Black student, that you were supposed to become either a doctor or an engineer. Is that right?
Oh yeah, yeah. That was the expectation.
Was that from your teachers or from your parents?
Well, from teachers mainly, and then my father died when I was 15, and so yeah, the expectations of teachers, of guidance counselors, was that a black kid who was good in math and science, you could make a lot of money being an engineer. No one even knew, hardly anyone even knew what an ornithologist was. When I would talk about majoring in zoology, people would be like, "Oh, so why do you want to be a zookeeper?" As if that was all that I could do. But because I was always good at jumping through hoops, because I was always good at following orders, I followed orders for a very long time, because it was the path of least resistance.
Hmm.
And I was being rewarded for it.
Mm-hmm. What turned you from that path when you're on your way to becoming an engineer, and as I understand it, you were just like kind of walked across campus one day and entered a new building saying, I'm going the biology route instead, but I know it was more complex than that. Can you just speak to that? How did that happen?
Well, Amy, it in some ways it was more complex. I mean, I tell people that this was a decision that was racking me, because I wanted to be independent. I was paying my own way through school. That's one of my core values is independence. I don't like depending on others, and I certainly didn't want my mother to be stressed with the cost of school. Certainly not that soon after my father had died. So I was in engineering for 3.5 years, hating every moment of it. I would go on these internships in the summer at the Savannah River site, a nuclear facility, and I was making a lot of money as a kid in the mid and late 80s. But I would go to my internships, and I'd have a calendar, and every day I would count the hours until I could mark an X through that day so that it would be over.
Wow.
I would watch the clock.
Hmm.
It was like watching my life tick away, knowing that I needed that I should have been doing something else. And so that spring day when I was on the way to a class and just stopped about halfway there, just stopped and turned around and walked back and sat with the blinds down, turned the TV on, watched cartoons, and ate bowl after bowl of Fruit Loops. I could not, I couldn't do it anymore. I was dying,
Hmm.
and I think that those years have served me well. In that, I always tell people now that whatever you do, if you're passionate about it, you'll be successful. But if you're dispassionate, if you're just sort of going through the script, so to speak, then ultimately that script is going to fall apart, and you're going to become resentful of your own life. You'll become resentful of others, and that's not a good thing. So that day that I turned around, um, changed my life. It's why we're here talking today. I don't. I think critically about that time, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure I would still be alive if I had not turned around
Wow.
for any number of reasons. I don't think I could have mentally withstood the sort of the continued pressure of living up to others' expectations. I don't think my body would have been healthy enough to sustain me. I think the stress would have been a contributing factor to an early demise, like it was for my father. So, um, it's never too late. Um, I think it really comes down though to making a decision on a walk somewhere and saying, you know what, I can't do this anymore. I'm going to do what I love to do, and then doing it.
And for you, that was birds.
Yeah, it was. I had walked through this building, Long Hall, from time to time, and I would see pictures, posters of animals, or I would see a skeleton or a study skin, and it just smelled different. It it smelled like an old biology building. The engineering buildings didn't smell like anything. They were sterile. There was no life there. It smelled like calculus, which calculus smells like steel desks and pencils and graph paper. And the biology buildings smelled like life happening somehow. Even if it was life gone past, it was life happening. So, Dr. Sid Gotro, he's a famous ornithologist and still a great friend, a mentor of mine. Um, I met him. I met my undergraduate advisor, Jim Schindler, who is a limnologist from Minnesota, and I met Dr. Patty Gawadi, an ecofeminist, who had a lot to do with how I think as a scientist and as a human being. And so those three people immediately embraced me. They didn't ask why I was there. They didn't discount me because of my color. They didn't say, "Well, you should be doing this." I told them what my heart's desire was, and they made it happen. They helped make it happen. So, three people who were very different from me, but very much like me, um, really helped me move into this place of, we were talking about strikes earlier. They helped me move into this place where I wasn't code switching daily. I didn't feel like I had to be one person in the engineering building than another person, someplace else. I felt more like me.
I'm curious, in terms of your classmates when you switched, did you go to an even wider cohort or was it more diverse when you moved into natural sciences?
Oh gosh, it was it was whiter. There were black kids in engineering because most of us had been recruited to Clemson at that time. So many of us had been recruited there as engineers, and it was the hot major. All of my frat brothers were most of them were in engineering. Most of the people I knew were in engineering. But when I got to this place where there were fewer people who looked like me, but people who felt like me, and thought like me, it was easier for me to make that adjustment. I felt like going into zoology, I regained my heart. And so I went from struggling in a major that I hated to speeding through a major that I think the only class I truly did not like in my zoology major was probably biochemistry. So yeah, Amy, it was less diverse, but it was more inclusive.
Hmm.
Um, it was an opportunity for me to blend my heart with other kindred spirits. So it was, again, like I said, it was a life saving decision that I made.
We're going to take a short break and then continue with the rest of my conversation with Drew Lanham. If you're just finding us, you might be interested to hear some of our adventures with bison, our explorations of the Arctic, and more. You can check it out by subscribing to Threshold wherever you get your podcasts. Welcome back to Threshold Conversations. I'm Amy Martin, and today I'm talking with author and ecologist Dr. J. Drew Lanham. In 2013, he wrote a piece titled 9 Rules for the Black Bird Watcher for Orion magazine. If people aren't familiar, I'll just read. The first one is be prepared to be confused with the other blackbirder. Yes, there are only 2 of you at the bird festival. Yes, you're wearing a name tag and are 6 inches taller than he is. Yes, you will be called by his name at least half a dozen times by supposedly observant people who can distinguish guillemots in a blizzard. And then you go on. Carry your binoculars and 3 forms of identification at all times. Don't bird in a hoodie, and it's funny, but it's also painful, and it speaks to all of the racism that you've had to face as a blackbirder. And I just wonder, can you describe some of the journey you took toward writing this piece? Because this came out, whatever it was, 7 years ago. What was your experience as a blackbirder like that led up to this really incisive piece of writing?
Well, Amy, I had lived it. I mean, I had thought about it. I had lived it. You know, I have been called the other birder by name with a name tag. I have been stopped and detained and asked for my ID. I have had um, most of those things either happen or I've thought about them happening, which means that it occupies headspace that I could be otherwise using to distinguish confusing fall warblers, right? But I'm thinking about where I am. I'm thinking about how people are going to respond to me. So I don't get to use all of my headspace for birds. I have to think about my identity. And more importantly, I have to think about how other people are thinking about my identity. And that's part of what race is about, right? Um, I can't remember the exact quote. My friend John Lane brought it up to me the other day, but James Baldwin made a statement about that all we really want as Black people is to be to be left alone, to be who we are, to not sort of be picked at, to be persecuted, to be picked out, to be persecuted. So, um, and it's funny because I told him, I said, that's sort of my definition of wildness, to be left alone, to be oneself. Um, and that's part of the reason that I admire birds, because they are who they are. And unless we decide to somehow bias our perceptions of them or who they are, they can go through their lives being the best, painted buntings that they are. No one says I don't see a painted bunting's color, but people will excuse their biases by saying, "Oh, I don't see color." Well, that's sad. So, that those 9 rules, I had lived them, I had thought about them. They still occupy my headspace. So, there are still rules that I kind of that I kind of live by. And yeah, I put on a hoodie or time or two, but I would not dare walk through, especially a white neighborhood in a hoodie, um, and give someone the chance to call the police on me because of suspicious behavior, because we see that happening.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, just in the last 2-3 months, we had Breonna Taylor killed in her own home by police officers, Ahmaud Arbery killed while out running, unarmed. Of course, George Floyd's murder, and on the same day that George Floyd was killed, Christian Cooper, while out bird watching in Central Park, had race weaponized by Amy Cooper, no relation. I want to play just a few seconds of the recording from that event here. And for listeners who haven't seen this, what you're going to hear is the voice of Amy Cooper, a white woman, who's responding to a request from Christian Cooper, a black man, to adhere to the signs instructing people to keep their dogs leashed. And as you listen to this, you need to know that Christian is not approaching Amy at all. In fact, at the beginning of the video, she approaches him somewhat aggressively, and he asks her to back off.
Please don't come close to me.
Please take your phone off.
Please don't come close to
And
me.
I'm taking a picture and calling the cops.
Please call the cops. Please call the cops.
I'm going to tell them there's an African-American man threatening my life.
Please tell them whatever you like.
She moves away, and Christian stands totally still at a distance as she makes this phone call.
There is an African-American man. I am in Central Park. He is recording me and threatening myself and my dog. And my... I'm sorry, I can't hear you either. I'm being threatened by a man in the ramble. Please send the cops immediately.
So this video has been viewed more than 40 million times so far. Amy Cooper has since lost her job and been charged with filing a false report, which is a misdemeanor punishable by up to a year in jail. Drew, I'm wondering how you found out about this. Did you just come across it in your news feed, or did someone tell you about it? Do you remember how this came to your awareness?
Yeah, social media, someone tagged me, and I know Christian. We had done a radio show where we had been, both of us had been interviewed on a New York radio station, on a local station. And so, wonderful man, that I had a chance to have a conversation with, and I birded in Central Park last June. It's one of the meccas, but I was going through my feed and someone just tagged me. And I remember looking at the video and then shutting it down. And I didn't really go back at it. And then I took a day, the next morning I posted. By this point in time that I decided to respond, everything was coming down. George Floyd was dead. I was already sort of in this wake of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor. And it was all just sort of this very morose, morbid Groundhog Day, reliving it, and just tired, just exhausted. And for the moment, I was like, man, people are dead. How do I deal with this assault, really, that Amy Cooper threw against Christian Cooper, somebody that I know? And then I began to think, if this had not been in the midst of COVID in New York at that time, dealing with the pandemic as it was at peak, if the police had responded, what might have happened?
Yeah.
Because then Christian's got to explain what he's doing. It may not have gone well.
Yeah.
So it's all sort of this, I don't know, kind of braided river kind of thing. But ultimately, braided rivers end up in the same place. And everything ended up in the same place at that point, Amy, and I could do nothing more than sort of live in it. So that's kind of where I am now, and living in this sort of sad, mad, scared place of being uncertain, of still living my heart from the perspective of doing what it is that I've always wanted to do, and being an ornithologist and having birds be my life and being able to write and talk about them. But at the same time, being a black man in a country that discounts me daily and ultimately um, has made a habit of discounting me by making people who look like me dead. So um, they're hard days to smile or find joy.
I I think that some people, white people who haven't been forced to think about this through their own life experience the way you have, might not understand the connection between the Amy Cooper incident, the Amy Cooper assault, as you accurately describe it, and George Floyd's murder. And obviously, I'm not saying these are the same thing, but there is a relationship between these two things.
Wow, yeah, I mean, it was almost like it was scripted. I talk about scripts, and we have scripts in our heads and our hearts, and hate is a script, and just as love is a script, and um, and her first take was to hate. Her first take was to use what she knew was a dangerous weapon against Christian. I mean, let's think about it. Gasoline is an essential thing. It fuels a car, right? An internal combustion engine. Gasoline fuels a car, and it's important. It's what we absolutely need. And so, in that way, blackness is who we are. It's our identity, right? It defines much of our internal combustion engine as a people. But then when people use that against you, it's taking that same gas and throwing a match at it. And that's what Amy Cooper did. Amy Cooper knowingly threw a match um, at a very combustible sort of identity, at least as far as this country is concerned. She was invoking death. And that's why I call it an assault. And part of the way that I guess I've departed from my grandmother's teaching is that I have no room in my heart to forgive hate because it's not adaptive. I think I'm at a point in my life, and I think maybe for us to understand that, and a late apology from someone because they've lost their job, because they've lost their dog, that it's too late, and um, that until the pain of not changing becomes greater than the pain of changing, you're going to remain the same. And so, to me, to forgive Amy Cooper, I can't do it, and maybe I'm the lesser person for it, Amy, but I just can't do it because she needs to pay for what she did. Um, she needs to be uncomfortable. She needs to be so uncomfortable that that script gets torn up and thrown out of her heart,
Mm-hmm.
and that she begins to think differently.
And through her, hopefully, a lot more people, like.
Yeah, yes, hopefully. That's the hope. I'm um there's some days that I'm hopeful, you know, about it. Unfortunately, right now, there are lots of days where it's just sort of, again, a Groundhog Day, as we heard about Elijah McClain, um, and what happened to that young man. I mean, it just sort of brings back up this morbid Groundhog Day. And so you spend day after day waiting for the next body to fall. So birds, and that my 9 rules take on, for me, they take on a different sort of tincture at that point.
I think the thing that incident, that assault, really, I felt like revealed, put on display in a way that I hope people really grapple with, is just how much all of this is about power. How she didn't like being told what to do. she didn't like being told to follow the rules that everybody else had to follow. And so in her grasping for power, she grabbed this violent weapon.
She verbally knelt on his neck, and she certainly assailed his identity. I mean, it's assault. It's an assault. Racism is many things. Perhaps most insidious is its assault on the soul, and the way that it wears on you, that most people can't see. Um, the way that it just sort of chips away. It's sort of like an underground current that you can't see, and then suddenly there's a sinkhole there because everything underneath it has been eroded away and just carried to some other place. And I think there are a lot of sinkholes just waiting to be exposed, unfortunately, in our society. The key is I think trying to anticipate some of that, trying to heal where you can, trying to stop the underground flow of racism and hate and bias and misogyny, all those things that our country's been built on.
Well, one of the things that's happened in response to all of this is some pretty inspiring online organizing. It started with Black Birders Week. There were thousands of black birders posting pictures of themselves out in the field, talking about the birds they loved and the places they loved. And then that led to Black Hikers Week, Black Botanists Week, Black in Nature, and more. Were you part of Black Birders Week at all?
Yeah, I got to participate. That was a phenomenon that I got to participate in. It was conceived by people like half my age, and it speaks to sort of the leverage of social media and young people who really have a different tool than we've had. I mean, there have been several of us working at this for a long time, so it's not a new movement. But I think the movement was enlivened, certainly leveraged by social media. And I think a lot of this story is still to be told. Um, it was a wonderful week in many, many ways. Um, but what I'm eager to see is conservation organizations, especially, how they carry through with it. That they just don't grab the low hanging fruit of a week and photo ops, that their policy changes, that their mission changes, that most importantly, where their money goes changes. Follow the money, and you'll understand the mission. And so I'm hoping that week, Amy, is leveraged into something much more powerful. Because again, it's sort of like, and I tell people I don't celebrate Black History Month because I live a Black History life. And so I don't want people to think that week was just sort of this low hanging, very sweet blackberry that they could grasp and be nourished. That they need to nurture that fruit. They need to nurture other fruits, and that's what I want to see. That's what I want to see.
So I guess just to wrap up here, I just like to bring it back to Aldo Leopold, one of your inspirations, as I understand it, and this whole notion of a land ethic, and I'm wondering if you feel like a land ethic and a social justice ethic in your own life or in general, can they be two distinct things, or are they? Do we inherently have to incorporate social justice work into conservation work and in our land ethics?
I no longer separate the two. People frequently pigeonhole our issues into urban issues, and urban is frequently code word for people of color, um, or rather, when people say inner city, certainly. But as a rural Southern Black man, I cannot separate growing up on land and having the freedom and the choice and and really the privilege of having land provide sustenance for family is something that impacts my this oneness of social justice and environmental justice. You know, breathing breathing is not a privilege, right? As George Floyd and so many others have pleaded for breath, um, there are others pleading more slowly for breath that are being choked out by pollution and by the impacts of climate change. That impacts communities of color and poor communities in ways that it does not impact majority communities and well-to-do. So I can't separate the air, the water, the soil, the earth from from my inalienable rights to life, liberty, and some pursuit of happiness. I can't separate them. And I think when we do separate them, when we do parse them apart, then that's a divide and conquer strategy. Because no matter how different we may be on the outside, physiologically, we need the same things. We require that clean water, potable water. You know, we shouldn't have days where we can't go outside because the air is so bad. And that if you're a child of color, then it's impacting you more than it's impacting a white child. So, you know, that ethic, you know, as Leopold says, to preserve the stability and the beauty of things long term, to keep every cog and wheel, to keep all those parts as an intelligent tinkerer. Well, to keep all the parts means to consider all the parts, and all the parts include all the people. So I'll never separate them. Birds and human beings and every other beast there is, we're all in this together.
It's been a real honor and a pleasure to talk with you today. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you very much, Amy. I appreciate being on Threshold, and I'm looking I'm looking forward to crossing more of them, and hopefully we get to talk again. Thank you.
One last note before we go. This past May, Drew Lanham wrote an update to his 9 rules for the Black Bird Watcher. It's called 9 New Revelations for the Black American Bird Watcher, and it was published in Vanity Fair. There's a link to both of those pieces on our website. Threshold Conversations is funded by the Park Foundation, Montana Public Radio, the High Stakes Foundation, and the International Women's Media Foundation's Howard G. Buffett Fund for Women Journalists. We're also powered by donations from listeners just like you. If you believe in our work and you want us to keep doing it, you can make your contribution at thresholdpodcast.org/donate. The team behind Threshold Conversations includes Nick Mott, Eva Kalea, Casey Simpson, and Angela Swatek, with help from Caroline Kurtz, Dan Carreno, Hannah Carey, Kara Cromwell, Katie DeFusco, and Matt Herlihy. Special thanks to Shamim Graff. Our music is by Travis Yost.